Okay, so here we are talking about personality theory today. Probably one of the most interesting topics we cover because we're all interested in why people do what they do. And the answer to that is anchored in personality theory. I love this picture. The front part especially reflects the distribution of people from the center in Africa throughout the world, is how it happened. We're all one really family because we all came from central genetics in Africa and branched out. We know that from mitochondrial DNA. So we're all cousins, every human being in the world. And this is a prism, which is the symbol of our lecture. So this lecture, personality theory, is really broken into two different lectures. This one and then the next one, which is a 7-perspective redo. And that's a shortened and somewhat expanded 7 perspectives. What's taken out is the history. What's remained is the essence of the personality theory of each of the perspectives that you need to know and remember, particularly for the comprehensive final. This slideshow, as well as for this test. So this slideshow, this module, this slideshow will introduce you to personality theory, trait theory, and personality tests. This is a mandala actually drawn by Carl Jung. A mandala is a circular image. They were done by our ancestors. You know, if you think about the Native American medicine wheel, it's a mandala that begins with the 4 directions, which is how temples and castles were built. Also, they had openings from that open to each of the 4 directions, and this would be Tibetan temples did this as well as castles and forts and so on. And so you have the outside world here that is influencing you, and then you move toward the center of the self, and the self is reflected in the center. And humans have been drawing mandalas for since we started doing artwork. We one of the earliest things we ever did was a circle with a line in the middle. So as well as the chevron, which is the V shape, V shape. So this is one of Jung's early. This would be a reflection or a symbol of the self, the larger psyche, the higher psyche buried deep within. And Jung is actually the source of the word higher self because he had the idea of self with a capital S. And when we discuss this kind of stuff, we're talking about personality theory, right? We're talking about the structure of the human personality. And Freud had a different idea with the id, ego, superego, and then Jung expanded on that idea. And this is a symbolic reflection of Jung's idea of the personality. And when we talk about that, we're talking about personality theory, which is what is behind the dynamic of the human personality and how does it develop. In this PowerPoint, we're going to focus on introducing you to that idea of personality theory, and then most of this PowerPoint is about trait tests and personality tests. So, introduction to personality theory with our prism. 2 major questions. Here's one of my favorite personalities. 2 major questions answered by personality theory. What are the basic elements of personality? And that's discussed or predominantly dominated by trait theory. And then how does personality form? And what are the components of personality? What are the essential constructs of personality, like when we think about Jung's mandala? What are the, or Freud's id, ego, and superego? That's the 7 perspectives. And the 7 perspectives, as I already mentioned, is mostly a review, plus we add a few new theorists. So personality is defined as patterns of thinking and behaving that are consistent across time and place. And you really want to focus on this word patterns because we don't always behave in the same way. We usually act that way. So we have some common patterns of behavior, and there's really a range of patterns of behavior, right? So we have a range from our best to our worst, say. So let's just take a moment just to anchor in to one aspect or one way of thinking about personality. And what are 3 words that you would use to describe your personality? What are 3 words that just immediately come to mind through the process of Freudian free association? So it might be words like friendly or rebellious or frisky or fun or studious or serious. And these are the kinds of words you might come up with. And then if you think about 3 words that your best friend might use to describe your personality, and you'll probably find if you did a bunch of lists of 3 different best friends and your parents and other people who know you well, that there'd be some words in common. And in fact, if you went and asked them, there would certainly be words in common. And those are patterns, looking for those words that people would have in common to describe your personality, right? Your personality, which, let's go back to the definition, is your patterns of thinking and behaving that are consistent across time and place, right? So those words that you would come up with to describe your personality are called traits. And this is just a fun little slide with Family Guy traits. I mean, Stewie, borderline, well, certainly oppositional defiant. He would be diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, and I'm sure you guys see psychopathic traits in there. So these are just a couple of traits. Many other words could be associated that we could use as descriptors for these people that would be like traits, right? Same with you, many traits. So the idea of trying to define who and what we are using terms like the descriptors we used for your personality is called trait theory. And it's huge. Trait theory is huge. And it has a lot of knowledge that is extremely valuable. And it's being used by companies, businesses, marketers, and so on all the time. It's well known. So it's useful for you to know because it's how people are organized. I mean, in my mind, I love the analogy of the video game because it gives us such a great metaphor. But if you take all the different kinds of characters that they could be, and you try to identify what their types are, right? Like, the promiscuous man, right? The outgoing promiscuous man. So what are those different types? How would we narrow them down? And if you narrow down all the different personality types and you just hone them into a small number of clusters, how would you sort and organize those? And that's what trait theory and typology is all about, trying to organize and categorize traits into meaningful patterns and clusters of human groups, of types. And those grand types, like the hero and the villain, Carl Jung referred to as archetypes, right? So, like, you can think of them as grand types. The other question that trait theory looks at is how much of our personality traits are genetic versus learned, and also identifying how personality traits can help us predict behavior, which is very powerful, right? If we know that somebody is extroverted and it tells us a lot about them, well, let's see what it does tell us about them, and a little bit about the history of trying to figure out how to put what is essentially an infinitude of traits into some kind of manageable group that we can study through research methods. So Gordon Allport was one of the early leaders on this, and he narrowed down traits to about 4,000, and then he worked with those and narrowed them down even more. And looking into Gordon Allport's work is one of the options for your assignment discussion. Raymond Cattell is another option for your assignment discussion. Cattell identified 16 traits, and you can see that they exist on a scale from reserved to outgoing. He's putting IQ and intelligence on here, and intelligence we could interpret as the ability to solve complex problems. At least that's one form of intelligence. There are other forms of intelligence, like athletic intelligence, natural intelligence, people who have the ability to interface with plants and animals, for example. Affected by feelings versus emotionally stable. This is, say, reactive versus emotionally stable. And you can see that because we're neuroplastic, we can move to some extent over the scale. So if let's say we're in a hyperreactive state, we can train ourselves to become more emotionally stable. So we can shift over here. We may not make it over here, but we can shift from, say, over here to over here. So we all have a range of potentialities on these. Submissive, dominant, serious, happy-go-lucky, expedient, conscientiousness, get things done fast, get things done methodically and carefully. Timid versus venturesome, or you could think adventuresome. tough-minded versus sensitive, trusting versus suspicious, and you can just rank where you might see yourself on here. And again, trusting is another. Well, all of these are moderately changeable, but we're going to have base set points, just like our metabolism does. We'll have base set points on these, and then, well, we'll come into the world with sort of base set points, but those base set points exist in a range. They're not a place. You do not come into the world marked at 3 reserved. You come into the world with a range of, say, 3 to 5, and then that range gets pushed in one direction or another by your environmental experiences, and it's 50-50 just to get to the bottom line. I mean, that's the average. Certain situations, it's more, but, the most it ever gets is like 60-40, so, or, 70-30 in a worst case. So it's like there's a lot of variability that comes from what happens in our environment, and you've been shaped by your environment so far, and you're going to continue to be shaped by your environment, not just what it does to you, but how you interface with it, and the decisions you make about how you spend your time, for example, what you eat, how you move, how you train your body to relax, and how you think. So, say your life experiences pushed you to your upper end of outgoingness, you could still evolve yourself to be more reserved or even push yourself even further. You may not be up here. Your range may not stretch quite that far, but we have a lot of self-actualization capacity as human beings because of our neuroplasticity. So trusting, suspicious, practical to imaginative, forthright to shrewd, self-assured to apprehensive, conservative to experimenting, group-dependent versus self-sufficient, uncontrolled versus controlled, relaxed versus tense. Okay, so looking into the history of why and how these were narrowed down to this particular group is really important and very fun. And looking into that is one of the options, as well as our parts for your assignment and discussion. What this slideshow is going to focus on is what is by far the research that dominates today and has an enormous amount of information just from this, and that is the Big 5 personality traits. So we can predict an enormous amount from the Big 5, and this is what dominates the discussion today. So I'm going to do the slideshow based on this. You can see that the Big 5 consists of being open, and this is being open to new experiences, extroversion, conscientiousness, stability, that's emotional stability, and agreeableness. So we'll be looking into this in depth. So, all right, trait theory helps us answer the question, what are the basic elements of personality? The other question explored by personality theory is how does a personality form and what are the essential structures of it, like the id, ego, and superego. And again, for that, go to the 7 perspectives slide. And here's the 7 perspectives on personality theory, where each one, I've put it in the definition of how it would specifically, in one sort of brief encapsulated phrase, approach personality. So from the psychodynamic perspective, it's influenced by the largely unconscious id, ego, superego dynamic. So here we have Freud's idea about the structure of the personality, and then we talked about his psychosexual stages in the developmental theory section. Remember the Oedipus complex, anal retention, and those ideas coming from childhood experiences. And he's right, we get a lot of complexes from childhood experiences, and complexes is a Freudian term. So that's Freud's, that's sort of a quick summary of Freud's ideas from the psychodynamic theory about how it approaches personality. Biologically, we look at personality traits are genetically and biologically influenced. So you can think about how hormones influence how a person's personality is being expressed. And there are strong biological influences by hormones. I mean, testosterone influences both sex drive and aggression. It interfaces with other things, so it's not by itself doing that. You have to have a mixture to bake a cake, right? So, but higher levels do influence that, and higher levels of estrogen are associated with bonding. So we, along with oxytocin. So so again, it's a mixture, but still, these things influence us and the way our personality expresses itself, not by themselves, but along with these other variables. Evolutionary is so connected to biological because it's about survival, which is a biologically based, and we looked at that related to our brain as well. But the emphasis is that traits evolve to support survival. All of them, are helpful. All the traits that we have are here because they have an adaptive value. So all the different types that we end up looking at, each of them has an adaptive value, the diversity of types. And businesses know this. They like to mix types together because they each have a different perspective. And if you don't mix them together, these different types, then we're not going to get all the perspectives. So let's jump up to behaviorism. Personalities shaped by social forces, in particular learning, right? Operant and classical conditioning. So we're shaped by both unconscious and conscious learning. But at the same time, we have the capacity to become self-aware and self-actualize, right? To transform personality through, letting go of old patterns and initiating new ones, essentially. And that takes a lot of dedication and will. Probably not much harder than changing your own personality. So, or aspects of your own personality, right? Becoming more empathetic and less harsh, which, by the way, is aided by biology and time, because over time, for example, men get more estrogen into their body and they tend to soften some unless the world has hardened them or their response to the world has hardened them. And that brings us over to how cognition helps shape and influence personality. Sociocultural, how social and cultural pressures influence personality would be how the world has either pushed the hardness or helped assist the softness. Biology helps assist the softness by adding estrogen into men's biochemistry later in life. That's their version of midlife that happens after the so-called midlife crisis in their 50s, 60s. And women, of course, go through the reverse. They get an increase in testosterone. So biological is influencing us all our lives in subtle ways we're just sorting out. So the next slideshow, you're going to review this. And again, the 7 perspectives is an anchor of the final. So it's really important that you keep going over it. And it's slightly revised. So you want to look at that too. And it will always be slightly revised. Because 7 perspectives is not just personality theory. It's also therapies. They each of them have an idea about how to approach therapy. There's biological therapies. There's psychodynamic therapies that address bringing forward unconscious impulses from the in. There's behaviorism therapies that mostly are about learning new ways of being, like learning how to be more assertive, or learning how to set better boundaries, or learning how to say stop, or learning how to approach, gaining the courage to voluntarily approach things that you're afraid of would be a big one. For example, phobias. Behaviorism is very effective. These kinds of therapies. Humanism, for touching base with deep meaning within yourself, what's really important, and what your highest vision of yourself is, right? That's addressing a dimension of human life that's really unique in the sense that it's reflected by the star. We'll gaze at a star and imagine that it reflects our highest vision of what could be. We wish upon a star, and it's an image of the highest way of being, and this is very important to us. This is an anchor to us. It's so important. So humanism touches on something that nothing else does, and it also touches on the reality that we are self-transforming, and biology shows that or proves that now with neuroplasticity, which is the brain is always changing throughout life, just like the trees out there and their branches, right? So, except we can influence the shape of our tree more than trees can influence their own. Sociocultural is how social and cultural forces shape our personality. Think about gender roles, for example, and attitudes toward beauty, or ideas about strength, or ideas about how emotion can be expressed, right? So in Italy, for example, people can be very emotionally expressive. Men can be very emotionally expressive about tender emotions and warmth and affection. They hug vigorously and things like that, whereas we're a little bit more reserved in the United States, and in other places they're considerably more reserved. So how does that influence us? And say, for example, how people interface with those emotions. So cognitive is how thought influences personality, right? And each of these has the therapies, as I mentioned. There's cognitive therapies, there's cognitive behavioral therapies, because the way we think is directly related to the way we behave. there's humanist-oriented therapies, sociocultural therapies, but most therapists use a combination of these. And now we're understanding which of the therapeutic strategies works for which kind of situation or condition. So we're getting research on that, which is very helpful for being able to apply the right therapy to the right situation and have it be effective in a shorter time frame than forever. So the 7 perspectives, there's an assignment discussion option. You can either choose to look at one of the 2 trait theorists that we talked about before, Raymond Cattell or Gordon Allport, or there's, I think, a couple others that you have the option of looking at, or you can look at a new theorist within the Neo-Freudian humanist or social cognitive school. So Neo-Freudians, we have Alfred Adler. He's the one who came up with birth order. Karen Horney brought in the idea of relationships. So these are Freudian trained. These are people, look, there's a woman, people who are actually studying under Freud and directly with him, part of the psychoanalytic school in Austria, although they can be from other countries like Carl Jung in Switzerland. And of course, Carl Jung broke from Freud because Freud broke from Carl Jung because he thought Carl Jung was so radically different. So I really should put Carl Jung down here. Combine him with humanism because he crosses over into humanism. Sometimes they'll put him with Neo-Freudian. He certainly was because he started in Freud's psychoanalytic school, right? So he's a choice with the idea of archetypes and collective unconscious. And of course, you can read what's in the book on this. I think the assignment tells you the right pages. But if it doesn't, obviously look under the name so you can find it. And there's an index there and even a search bar you can use on that free textbook PDF, the OpenStax. So humanists, we look more into Carl Rogers or Abraham Maslow. Many of you have heard about Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. Well, Maslow did it first with the qualities of self-actualized people. And those qualities are valuable to know. So I'm hoping somebody will go, copy paste the qualities themselves into the discussion so people can look at it. Because it's helpful to look at those qualities and say, okay, where do I stand on this self-actualization scale? And Maslow got this from research. It didn't come from nothing. He was studying, just like Stephen Covey, people who had reached self-actualization. So it's a very interesting reflection. And then Julian Rotter and this idea of internal versus external locus of control, a social cognitive or a social behavioral, those you can use any of those terms, social behavioral cognitive, basically combining social environment, learning, and cognition, all right, and understanding where is our center of control? Is it internal or external? This is extremely powerful, and it's also something that you have the powerful ability to change. It is a more subtle teasing apart of what's going on with the optimistic and pessimistic mindset, and really important teasing apart. So those are discussion options. This slideshow, we're going to go back now to focusing on trait theory and what we're on what we're going to be examining here. So personality is patterns of thoughts and behavior that are consistent across time and place. Sometimes they say consistent across space to encapsulate both the ideas of time and place. So the idea is that we think about the same way most of the time. And one of the concepts recognized in personality theory is referred to as situation-specific behaviors. That means that certain situations bring out certain behaviors. And it's a really interesting thing to reflect on, is that situations bring out different kinds of behaviors. Same person, different behaviors in a different context. What this reflects is a range of her behaviors, right? So, and that we understand that we need to realize that sometimes when we are put in situations like war, where we've never been put in those situations before, we just don't quite know how we will behave or what our range of behavior is. So there's a lot of repercussions or implications to the fact that our behavior is situation specific. So we can come up with specific words that we refer to as traits to describe our or someone else's personality, because we do consistently behave certain ways over time. Our personalities show what are referred to as persistent patterns of behavior. So that's a common term that you'll see. And you see that in the personality disorders too. So the personality disorders, I'm doing a small segue here. There's no slide on this here. I should probably add one to this unit on personality disorders, but they include the most common ones that you hear about are narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder, which is akin to the psychopath. So when you have those three personality disorders, in the definition is persistent pattern of behaving. That's the beginning of the definition. Persistent pattern of behaving like a narcissist, persistent pattern of behaving like a psychopath, persistent pattern of behaving like a borderline. So what those persistent patterns are is very clearly defined. We tend to use those terms sloppily in our culture. Diagnostically, they're much more rigid. They're a much more smaller category. So people, we can say somebody, oh, they're so borderline or they're so bipolar, when they may very well not be diagnosed as bipolar or borderline. We overuse the terms, but and too casually, because they're the same terms that refer to very serious diagnostic categories. And the diagnostic categories of those three disorders, personality disorders, they all start with the word persistent pattern of behaving. And when they mean by persistent pattern is that person behaves that way all the time in every situation to an extremely extreme degree. So we'll go over that in more detail under the disorders section. But again, situation persistent. Specific refers to situation persistent, but not always, because life situations bring out different part of us, different aspects of our personality. And if those conditions persist over time, imagine that you spend all your life, I mean, we've all spent some time with people who bring out the best in us, and you can imagine somebody who's the person who has brought out the absolute worst in you. Well, what if you were in an environment all your life where you were around people who brought out the absolute worst in you? That's going to steer your personality in a particularly negative direction, and the usual negative directions are the internal distress of anxiety and depression, the externalized distress of, criminal behavior or substance abuse, criminal or aggressive behavior, right? So those are most of the ways that our distress shows itself. So you can see that we can be pushed into an extreme level of our range of potentialities, either in the positive or negative direction. So you can see on this side that it's doing what I just did verbally with you guys. It's walking you through the idea that imagine yourself like spending all of your childhood around people who brought out the absolute worst in you. That would have a powerful impact on your personality as compared to spending your childhood with people who brought out the absolute best in you. That's radically different. Most of us fall somewhere in between, hopefully more geared toward people who bring out the best. It obviously takes some recovery time in adulthood for people who spent their childhood around people who brought out the worst. But you can see the power of the situation when you reflect on that, and in shaping the personality, not entirely, because there's biological foundations that give us a range of potentialities, but still we can be steered toward the better or worse part of the range. And then we land, we wake up there as an adult into an adult brain with whatever we got from that. And we have to decide what to do about it, right? We can build and add to our world, and as an adults, we can build and add our social situations, and we can do so consciously, and that's what this little part is about here. So when it comes to genetic predisposition versus environment, it's about 50-50, but remember the genetic predisposition comes as a range. So the trait tests will tend to give you a fixed point about where you are now in this moment of your potentiality of being on a range. So always remember that you always exist on a range of everything on the trait test, and it shows your current place. Some traits are more fixed than others. Let's say extroversion and introversion are a little bit more biologically fixed, you have a tendency or preference. It's sort of like your preference. Your preference of sleeping on your right side or your left side. Extroversion and introversion are fairly, and even optimistic and pessimistic mindsets have a sort of pre-wired orientation, but we can radically rewire that because of neuroplasticity, but it'll take some work, right? It'd be like, it takes some work to change your metabolism, and it takes a little work to change your brain to shift it over, but you can do it. And it's not in any way so hard that, it's not like trying to run a marathon. It's more like learning how to do walk 3 miles on a regular basis kind of thing, or walk a mile to 3 miles on a regular basis. That's more what it's akin to. So, on a psychological level. So now we're moving into the big five. And here we look at the question of, will some aspects of our personality still be consistent regardless of environmental conditions? So what is really, really salient, what really, really lasts when you pare it back and pare it back and pare it back and pare it back and pare it back. And again, scientists came up with 5. So we're going to dive in now a little bit more deeply into this big 5. The first of the big 5 is extroversion or introverted. So you can see here that we can predict a lot from extroversion and introversion, and this is just a small, short list. But if you, and again, it all exists on a range, so we put a little scale on here, 1 to 10, and you just say where, think about where you are on the scale, and it's extroversion and introversion is sort of a natural biological impulse. It's like it's how you get energy, it's how you get. Do you get energized by being around other people? Do you get energized by spending time alone? Or you more drawn to the external world, or you more drawn to the internal world? It's a pull. So you can see how different these two types are. And because people are curious and like people that are different from them, we can get extroverts and introverts together in a couple, and obviously they're going to have some challenges because the extrovert's going to want to go out a lot and the introvert's going to want to stay home a lot. But it's not just that. It's how they sort through problems, and the extrovert is going to feel left out of the introvert's problem solving, and the introvert will quickly become annoyed by the extrovert's need to talk everything over, especially if the people are an extreme. Right on the extreme. If you're both in the middle, it's pretty easy for you to toggle back and forth. But it's the areas where we're on the extreme from one another, the opposite of the prism, where it's hard to grasp the other person's point of view, right? So we have to learn to work more towards understanding each other. And that's one of the great values of understanding the different personality types, so you can understand how other people think and are structured, and adapt your interface with them so that you are more attuned to each other. Attunement means that there's understanding and connection. So it's a deeper level of truth. It's stretching your personality so that you can, using the tool of empathy, which is one of the great human capacities, which I don't know that I see quite. The two things I see personally, I think are under tested are empathy versus dominance, but that's just my thing. So my personal analysis. And this part here again just states that we can stretch ourselves, right? But if you're way over here, you're not going to go way over here. You're going to go to here. And if your extrovert goes to here, you guys will find your meeting place, right? So that's the idea. So that's typology. Type, what trait type are you, is referred to as typology. So personality type tests like the Big 5 are also referred to as typology tests. So this is just a little reflection on the introverted extroverted couple, which is just one small dimension. Remember, Cattell is 16, and Cattell's 16 factor test is frequently used still, and there's many personality tests, but the Big 5 is by far the biggest and most researched. But there are still many personality tests that go in and hone in on a particular subdimension of personality and things like that. And we're only looking at one right now, and already we can see insights. right? So these are the big five traits, and they're laid out so using the old acronym OCEAN, OCEAN, so that you can memorize them, because it is important that you do memorize them. We'll go into them in a little bit more detail in future slides, so we're just going to review them here. The first is open to new experiences versus preferred, the tried and true, and again, imagine our scale. Conscientiousness, order, structure, and detail versus relaxed and groovy. Extroversion, energy outward versus introversion, energy inward. Agreeableness, positive, nurturing, and compassionate versus disagreeableness, which is critical and negative and harsh and cold. Kind of like the TV show persona House, if you know of him. Neuroticism, also referred to as emotional stability these days, is prone to anxiety or negative affect. Remember, affect means emotion. So, prone to anxiety or negative emotion. The acronym OCEAN can help you remember them, right? So, today, emotional stability is often used instead of neuroticism because of the stigma attached to neuroticism. But professionals within the field don't have that same stigma. They know neuroticism means vulnerability to anxiety and negative affect, so they don't add and it's your fault to to the other half of the equation. Part of it's biological vulnerability combined with environment. So if you're highly biologically vulnerable, you come out vulnerable to being neurotic, and then or vulnerable to negative emotion, right? You feel a lot of anxiety and negative feelings, and then you're in a negative environment. It's really gonna, whose fault is that? Nobody's, right? But as Will Smith says, blame and responsibility aren't the same thing. I love his talk on that somebody else may be to blame, but it's still our responsibility, especially now that we're adults. So here's big five correlates so you can see how they work. Conscientiousness has these sub-traits that are associated with it. So people who are high in conscientiousness are competent, they're orderly, they're dutiful, they're achievement striving, they have high self-discipline, they're deliberate, they make focused decisions, they have high self-efficacy. If you remember, efficacy means the feeling that I can do it. I can do it, not that I can't do it, right? Oh, I can't do that. High self-efficacy is I can do it, low self-efficacy is I can't do it. They tend to be orderly. It's one subdimension of conscientiousness is orderly. The other main subdimension, that means you like things organized. So the other dimension is industrious. So achievement striving, self-discipline, and cautiousness. So again, this can exist on a scale. Completes tasks versus misjudges and doesn't, leaves things undone, likes order versus leaves a mess, follows the rules versus break the rules, works hard versus do just enough to get by, that's industriousness. Gets chores done right away versus waste time, that's also industriousness. So we come out with a certain energy that is conscientiousness and exists on a range with our distribution curve. Most people in the middle, really high conscientious people, really low conscientious people, and that exists. So we have our messy people and our messy tendencies, and most of us are less conscientious than we want to be. The vast majority of because the middle of the population, our culture and the way we structured it with the capacity, machines are very conscientious. So we have a high efficiency requires high conscientiousness. And so we have a culture that expects high conscientiousness. So we're all sort of here, and we need to shift over here in order to function well. So fortunately, this is a changeable one. This is one of those ones where, are you procrastinating on your homework or are you getting it done? Now, conscientiousness people who come out of the block over here, they like doing that automatically, see? And so that it's just built into them. They like to put things in order. They like to organize all their stuff. Whereas these people here, they sort of like it, they sort of don't. So something more fun that's in their back pocket, like the internet and Facebook, is going to pull them over to here. And, the society is not tolerant of that. So that gets scary. So this is one we've got to work out. And this relates to This is one where you can increase your self-discipline and your focus and your ability to get things done. You can do this by improving habits. The best way to improve conscientiousness is to improve habits. And Kelly McGonigal talks about that back in the early discussion on the willpower instinct. Remember, under motivation and motivation, you can you can look at the YouTube lecture on the willpower instinct, and there's a lot of stuff. You just follow the trail from there and learn about how you can use habits to improve your conscientiousness, because high conscientiousness is highly correlated with success. So it's really important to get on top of your game and to use these years to improve your conscientiousness. All right, neuroticism. And of course, some of you are already over the top conscientiousness. You're already over here, so you got to watch out for perfectionism, because that's your ballywick. Neuroticism, emotional stability can be built. So we all have a range of vulnerability to negative affect, and you've got all these kinds of feelings and emotions, or these kinds of words that if you feel like you experience them a lot, then doing things, you got to do things differently. You're going to have to add things that shift you out of these modes and teach you how to shift out of these modes and help you add, if you're going to look at it neurochemically, how dopamine and serotonin hang out more in your bloodstream by doing things that stimulate it. And since it's a neurochemistry thing, this is where biological interventions can be helpful, especially to help a person shift out of major patterns, develop new patterns, and then you can let those biological interventions, or you can see how they work, falling away. Remember, we're always going to deal with the distribution curve. So that means that some people are going to get the raw end of the deal in terms of this, and their biochemistry is going to be low, and biological interventions could be helpful. But so is diet and exercise and social relationships, and you get those foundations in place, and positive supportive environments and all those kinds of things, because they modulate negative emotion. Remember, social environments, social people around us balance off, positive people around us help, just being around them offsets negative emotion. So extroversion versus introversion, and there are actually jobs. I mean, there's jobs that extroversion, like sales, it's harder for an introvert to like sales, an extreme introvert. Anybody in the middle can, this range here of the distribution curve, you're fine. But if you're over on an extreme of introversion, then you don't want a job where you get to spend more time by yourself, because it's just going to wear you out too much every day to go out there and push, right? And extroverted, you don't want to work by yourself all day, because you're going to become frustrated, lonely, and discouraged, because you get energized being with people. So being aware of where you are on this, and setting up your work world to be in alignment with it so it supports your natural type is really helpful, because this one is fairly fixed. I mean, you can shift it, and you can certainly push yourself and shift it, but it's mostly got a moderately solid set point. Now, agreeableness, the reason why this one is fixed is because disagreeable people don't want to bother changing. It could be fixed. I mean, Martin Seligman, the guy who learned helplessness and its association with depression, and studied that for 20 years, was a major grump and transformed himself into a happy guy and a very agreeable person, because he realized the lack of utility in bothering to be such a negative person, and started the whole movement on positive psychology and learned optimism and all that. Research-based, he was president of the American Psychological Association for 20 years. But, people who are highly agreeable, like this again is on a curve. And so this one being in the middle is good, because there are people that are highly disagreeable, and you need to be able to deal with them. I should probably put that down here. And there are people who are highly agreeable, and they can be really stomped on by disagreeable people. So if you're way over here, and women tend to be more agreeable than men, because we're sort of biologically wired for it, right through the evolutionary hundreds of thousands of years, millions of being the ones that interface with the newborn. So that gives you more practice, essentially, and the man is protecting the vulnerable mother and newborn, so that gives him more practice at being disagreeable. So that would be a evolutionarily wired in thing, but it's not 100%. It's just a small variance in terms of gender, a modest variance, let's call it, and but it is there. It is definitely there. Women, And I think that it's important that people realize on this one that if you're super agreeable, you need to get a good perspective of the whole range of reality so you're prepared to deal with disagreeable people. And disagreeable people hopefully will find it valuable to become more balanced as well. Now, openness to new, this is open to new experience. And what this is related to is people who like to explore new ideas versus traditionalist. So the smaller amount of the population is high on openness. And you see this reflected in all those stories and mythologies where they show a young rebellious teenager who bucks the status quo, right? Who stands up against, and that's that high openness to new experience person. Of course, we need to sustain our structures, so that we can pass on what's good about what we've learned from the past. But if they become too rigid, then they become tyrannical. So they always need to be shifted, pushed to new ideas. But if everybody was off daydreaming, right, we never get the bread made. So most of us are not geared to be extreme on openness to experience. The intense creatives are, and it's tough if you're high openness to new experience unless you have high conscientiousness, because if you're open to new experience and low conscientiousness, we don't really have any jobs for that in our culture. So you're going to have to cultivate this conscientiousness, right? I'm not sure. There are very few jobs that have cultures that have a job for a high openness and low conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is the willingness to do the things that need to get done, the tedious, mundane chores. Okay, all of the big five have a positive and negative aspects, right? So if you move to an extreme on either one, so high openness can be creative and receptive, but they can also be perceived as unpredictable, unfocused, flaky. Low creatives can be perceived as pragmatic and data-driven, but they can also be perceived as closed-minded and dogmatic. So you can see how if we're too extreme on the traits, need for high stable people, they can be seen as uncaring or uninspiring, reactive and excitable people, unstable or insecure. So you can see how developing a certain amount of balance on these is valuable. I'm looking here at this conscientious one. High conscientious, persistent and driven, but you go overboard, they can be stubborn, workaholics, obsessive, right? At the same time, great things get done through people who really go all in. Think Elon Musk, right? Total workaholic, low, flexible, spontaneous, low conscientiousness. Flexible, spontaneous. A circus characters is like what you imagine, and then sloppy and unreliable. I don't mean circus characters in terms of the very skilled acrobats and everything. I mean the clowns and the fool. They're seen as free loving. They don't have to do anything, right? But our structured society, which now is almost, watch out for it becoming too structured like machines, because we are not machines. But we got machines all around us, so we'll be vulnerable to organizing structures around them instead of ourselves. Anyway, you get the idea here. Now, what's powerful about the Big Five is that it predicts an enormous amount, far more than we're looking at here. But you can see how, if you can sort out where a person is on how traditional versus open to new things they are, how conscientious they are, how extroverted or introverted, how agreeable and how sensitive to negative emotion they are in a 15-minute conversation. And all of that gives you data and information about that person to help you understand how to attune or connect with them. Now, somebody else could say how to manipulate them, but that's a psychopathic kind of approach, which is the opposite of what psychology, which is akin to and born from the world of physician, doctor, medicine, and do no harm, right? So that would be the opposite of that. So, of the real intent of it, which is more to establish attunement and connection and greater empathic connection with another person, so you understand better how they think, the uniqueness of their psychological structure, and you adapt yourself to that so you can relate, right? So you're not changing yourself, you're just tuning in to their frequency better, right? So we can see that people who score lower on openness, they don't like to be exposed to alternative moral systems. They have a narrow band of interests. They're not particularly interested in the arts, and this is really low scores. People often are in the middle, remember. And they're very down to earth and very traditional. So think about the most ultra traditional person you know. And then high scores, think about the most creative, abstract thinker, willingness to try new things that you know, right? And then conscientiousness. Low scores like to do things spur of the moment. Everything will be a mess everywhere. And they, so the subtraits of conscientiousness are orderliness and industriousness. So there's not any order and they're lazy. They don't want to do anything. Lax. So the other end of it is OCD, obsessive, right, about everything. Extroversion, well, a low scoring extrovert would want to be alone most of the time. A high scoring would want to be with people all of the time. Agreeableness, low scores would be, well, quickly and confidently asserts rights, dominator type behaviors, easily irritable, is not concerned about being manipulative, uncooperative, rude, blunt. House is a good example, the character of low in agreeableness, and high goes along with everything. Ultra high, right? Just kind of what we think of as a doormat. And then neuroticism, low scores don't get irritated by, an extreme low score could be psychopathic, right? No fear, does not fear any fear. No emotion. High scores, always dealing with anxiety and worry. Now, having some neuroticism, negative emotion, is actually highly correlated with success. The traits here that are most correlated with success are conscientiousness, moderate neuroticism, moderate openness, because there's a lot of change in our culture. So being able to be open to change and adaptable is a helpful trait these days. So here's more about the power of prediction and how these kinds of scores, like jobs that score high, activate these traits, making them relevant to predicting behavior. So high in conscientiousness requires detail. The detail-oriented jobs work really well for them. Low scores, not as good a job for somebody who's high in conscientiousness. So you can see that and there's enormous amount of detail that's actually a lot easier to read than this. This is a matrix laid out from a research report, but you can see how how these variables will be cross-related. High extroversion, high agreeableness, high in these scores, clergy, therapist, concierge, of a hotel or a resort. Low in these scores, these kinds of jobs. High in extroversion and agreeableness, these scores lower, so on. So you can see the jobs that call for the different kinds of skills. Like, for example, one that really stands out with the Big Five is that lawyers need to be at least moderately disagreeable, especially those that, because they have to argue all the time. And if they're not disagreeable, it'll just wear them out having to deal with all that argumentation. So it's long-term satisfaction and success in lawyer careers is highly correlated with have tendency to have a more disagreeable personality. And you can see the opposite would be the case in childcare. So it's really interesting to realize that these different personality characteristics have different value in different contexts. And it's helpful to match yourself up with a context that works with your own personality structure that brings out the best in it, say, for example. Okay, and this is another one about how the big 5 traits predict behavior at work that you can take a look at. This is Sam Gosling wrote a book called Snoop. He's a faculty member, I forget where, who uses the big 5 or shows you how you can use the big 5. He's got quite a few YouTube lectures online. They're fun to watch about how you can use the big 5 personality traits to gain insights into the people around you. And here's a couple more videos where he shows you this type is totally different from this type. And you can tell by looking at things like people's rooms and offices and their Facebook pages, what kind of typology they are. And like, this is very helpful to know if you're sitting across from a boss wanting to ask for a raise, understanding your typology, understanding your boss's typology. You can strategize your approach much more efficiently and effectively by thinking those kinds of things through. If you're a highly agreeable person and your boss is a highly disagreeable person, you're going to be vulnerable to feeling smacked by them all the time when he doesn't really mean anything, or she. Okay, so this is the kind of ways that personality type can help us understand and gain insights into the way other people think other than we do, and also get ourselves to match ourselves into good situations, particularly in the work environment. And our Career Center here at Butte College can help you with these kinds of tests and learn from them. So another personality typology test is the Jungian typology test, later transformed into the Myers-Briggs personality test by a mother-daughter team, Isabel Myers and Catherine Briggs. It's another common trait test based on 4 dimensions of personality preference that Carl Jung identified. Genius, brilliant person that he was. I mean, working with the data that he had back then, it's pretty remarkable that he's able to identify these. Little less validity and reliability measures on these, but it's still very commonly used in the Myers-Briggs personality test format. Let's take a look at what it shows. Again, we have the extroversion and introversion matrix, which is how we get our energy, right? Then we have how we process information. Sensates like the tried and true, bottom line, facts. Intuitives, these are like our high openness to new experiences. They like abstract ideas and possibilities, fantasy, imagination, science fiction, dreaming about what could be, whereas the sensate wants to know what is, what's the bottom line. So if you're an intuitive person and your boss is sensate, it's good to know that, because these people prefer and understand different words than these people prefer. You know, even understanding the kinds of words that speak to the sensate mind is valuable. Sometimes when I do talks on personality type, I talk about how it's a Star Wars bar out there. Anybody who's watched Star Wars, and it's even big now. I mean, my 8-year-old grandson is enjoying Star Wars and wants Star Wars characters, and that's because they're archetypal. They transcend type. If you took all the types in all the world and reduce them into 16 types, and that's what Jung did, 16 characters on the game called life of being a human being that you get to choose from. That's his 16 types, right? And they're organized by these 4 characteristics. So then how we make decision, do you run them through your head or do you run them through the heart? A question here is, he uses forced choice questions for these. It would be a question like, and you have to pick one, so it's like, which are you 51% of the time, right? If it comes down to being that close of a between the two things. But which of these is more valuable to you, justice or mercy? Justice, mercy. Very similar concepts, and yet one of them is anchored a little bit more in the head, or one of them is a little bit more in the body and the heart. And then these are how you deal with time and structure. Judge people like things organized, ritualistic, scheduled. They like to follow things. These would be like high conscientious people. Perceivers on the big five, perceivers like things open-ended and loose and relaxed and groovy. And so you mix them up and you combine them in various ways and you end up with Jung's 16 personality types. Which I can't believe I didn't put a slide of that on there. I'm sorry, I need to do that. So his 16 archetypes that he came up with. So another trait test is the MMPI, which is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Test. And this is specifically used to diagnose psychological disorders, and in particular in mental hospitals and things like that. So here are some sample questions from the MMPI, and you can Google to look at more sample questions from the MMPI. But they mix these kinds of questions with innocuous questions, like questions that, don't have an obvious answer or don't seem to be looking for any kind of answer. So that starts people not trying, because you just sort of answer those honestly, right? There's a yard in front of your house or things like that. Just innocuous questions. You had a dog when you were a child, that don't imply to sort of, they embed those within these so that these get lost amongst those, so that people develop the pattern of answering the question honestly, because it's not innocuous and digging for something, but these kinds of more revealing questions are embedded within the questionnaire. And it helps see, again, what we're looking for is patterns in these tests, patterns. So some things to know about trait tests. First of all of them exist on a range, and they're just measuring your point at that point. And some of them have, long-term reliability, like the Big Five has long-term stability. So if you took the test today and you took the test in 5 years, it'll be relatively similar within a range, however. Some of the traits do change with time, like we become less neurotic with age. I guess probably we just get used to dealing with negative emotions and maybe start to shift them, or maybe it has something to do with neurochemistry. So or maybe we get a little bit more stable, but with our environmental conditions, or we just get used to dealing with the psyche. But they do, some of them shift with time, so they do exist on a range, and they can help us understand other people enormously. It's easier for us to understand and get along with people who have similar traits as ours and are in a similar trait range. And it's very difficult for us to understand people who are way over here when we're way over here. But it's valuable, and we need to. And we need to understand the range of personalities that exist, because we exist in a world that is not just our personality type. And we tend to have most conflict with people who have vastly different traits than we do. We also have a presumption that people who think differently than we do don't think quite as well as we do, right? That's a self-serving bias. We tend to think our traits are better than everyone else's. And this is, again, the self-serving bias. We tend to think our attention, whatever it is, our attention to detail is better than our partner's flakiness, or our ability to see the big picture and the holistic picture and is better than our anal retentive partner, right? Or whatever it is. But the whole idea of trait psychology, the whole insight of it is the prism, that what we're dealing with here in the world is the prism. And evolutionary theory tells us or the a priori assumption of it is that they have a value, that those traits survived the adaptive process of humanity evolving because they have a value. And companies think that way. So they like to combine people with different traits, because if you've got everybody with the same set of ideas, you develop this thing called groupthink. There are several dimensions to groupthink. One is that you have, people think differently, but they don't speak up. But the other one is that everybody in the group thinks the same. And when that happens, that can feel good, but it means that this group is not grasping what the rest of the world is like, and it's also going to miss things, because there are benefits to this personality type, but and thinking type way, but there are also disadvantages. So companies like to mix people of different personality types together. That's why they do the Myers-Briggs, is to create different kinds of people working in teams, because each one of them brings a strength and weakness. The challenge of that is, of course, and so you won't miss things so much. You won't make as many mistakes. You'll come up with better ideas. The challenge of that is that you've got to be able to get along with people who think really differently from you. And something that helps you get along with people who think really differently from you is understanding personality theory, because then you can intellectualize it and not personalize it. You can say, oh, they think differently because this is how they're structured, not they think differently because they're dumb or not as smart as me or not as good as me, or some of the more rudimentary mindsets that we go into whenever we're not understanding something different from us. So it's through understanding and insight about personality theory and diving into it more, learn about these types, that we can gain enormous amount of information that helps us with our social skills and interfacing with other people and working with really different types of people without getting reactive. So things to know about, and there's training in that too. There's classes that you can take that will train you in that, like Psych 20, Personal and Social Growth, Psych 36, Meditation and Mindfulness, Psych 34, Eastern Traditions. These all help you gain skills in adapting and working with diverse personality types in the work environment and in our personal environments. All right, a couple things that you should know about personality tests. First of all, it's really hard to develop a good one because if you remember from the research methods section, tests have to be reliable and valid. Reliable means that they do what they say they will do. If it says it's going to measure stress, it actually measures stress and not something else, right? And it's actually hard. I mean, it doesn't sound like it right away, but it's actually hard to make sure your test is measuring what it says it measures. And how do they do that? How do they do that? Well, you create a test on happiness, and then you compare it with another test on happiness. And you make sure that you see if your happiness test matches that happiness test. And places where there's incongruence, you start to work on those too. So test comparison and then test retest. You give people the test on happiness today. You give it in 2 weeks. You give it in a month. See if they have similar test scores. You know, it's those kinds of things. Lots of different testing of the test to make sure that it's reliable and valid, that test scores are consistent. So of all the personality tests out there, the Big Five has by far is the most tested, the most reliable, and has the most correlates for us of things, behavioral predictors, things we can predict from it about behavior. Another thing we should know about tests, and this is related to all tests, is that all tests where we fill in the blank and we write in the answer is the self-report bias. And this is the case, like, for example, if you go to a counselor and you feel like you have anxiety, they're going to give you a little checklist for anxiety disorder. And it's pretty easy. I mean, there isn't a person on this planet that could, at some point in their life, be diagnosed formally with anxiety disorder because of how much, well, there are a few people that are just too relaxed and groovy for it. But I'd say about 70% could be formally diagnosed because you check off a checklist. And when we check off a checklist, we tend to report ourselves as either better or worse than we really are, depending on our personality type, right? So that's always a problem with self-report tests, what is referred to as self-report tests, where you are answering the question from your own opinion. It's not other people's opinions. And the way they balance self-report tests is by using other tests. One of them is by having other people fill in the questionnaire. So let's say you have a child who is acting out in a pretty severe way, and it's requiring some formal intervention, right, from the state, right, Department of Behavioral Sciences. And so the parents fill in a checklist, and if it's an adolescent, the adolescent will fill in the checklist, and then so will teachers and peers maybe even, right? So we'll see the patterns of responses from the variety of people instead of just the self-report or just the parental report. That's one way. Another way is to use other kinds of tests. So let's look at a couple of other kinds of tests besides these more objective tests that we've been looking at where you fill in blanks like with the Big Five. One of them is the other kind of personality tests that they use are called projective tests. And projective tests is when you look at something like this image, and this is a Rorschach ink blot test image, and they're actually designed to be disturbing and evocative and sort of obvious. I mean, the kinds of things that this is supposed to bring out in you is supposed to be obvious, right? Because there can be sexual connotations, people see birds here and things like that. But when people start coming up with ultra violent and aggressive words in a consistent pattern, then those kinds of things show up when you use projective tests. And you can look at, because people are projecting their inner psyche onto this and saying what's there, right? And if you do it enough, if you give people enough cards to react to, psychopathic people who are trying to deceive you and trying to falsely answer these kinds of tests, after a while, their ego defenses start to get a little tired, or they can, and they can start to loosen up and or get arrogant and reveal things that help the analysts gain insight into the person. Here's another Rorschach inkblot test. Rorschach inkblot, right? And so again, what they've done, or what Herman Rorschach did, was give these images to a large battery or group of individuals that were considered normal or average, and then he gave them to a large group of people who were considered deviant in some way, and so in identified ways, and then he looked for patterns in there of the way they would respond to this and codified it. And it's abstract and subjective, so it doesn't come up with consistent. For example, if you have 3 different therapists who use this Rorschach inkblot test on 3 different people, they might come up with on the same person, they might come up with 3 different perspectives, particularly if the person is not radically deviant. It's more helpful in the more extreme cases. Another projective test that's a little bit more subtle, but does the same kind of thing, and these are really similar to Freud's dream interpretation. They're psychodynamic-based tests. They're plumbing the unconscious for, or trying to sort of sidestep ego defenses to see what's really going on in the unconscious, to see if they can get a peek in there at other psychological forces going on. And there's two times when this can be valuable. One of them is if a person is deliberately hiding information and deceiving, say, criminal. And the second would be someone who can't connect, is confused by their own behavior and can't access things, either because of repressed or forgotten, or areas of dissociation, parts of their life and themselves that they're dissociated from. And this can help bring that kind of thing forward. So what they do is they show people, again, a bunch of cards with these images that can be interpreted in lots of ways. And they look for patterns of interpretation and, patterns of, say, malevolence, which is the desire to do harm. They see patterns of that in the stories and interpretations that the people come up with to these images. Here's another image, and you can see that there's lots of ways a person could tell a story of this. Do they use any words related to fear at all after writing 10 stories or 8 stories over a period of a couple days, or maybe even just one day? Short little stories. You can do these 5-minute stories and write out these little scribble out, or you can do longer stories. So there's different ways of approaching this. In any of them, whether you did a bunch of cards at once in a period of time, or 5 cards with a long story each of 45 minutes, any of them are designed to exhaust the ego defenses to the point where some of the underlying hidden repressed aspects of the psyche, or hidden voluntarily or involuntarily, can surface and be looked at. Now, they're more subjective and not as clear to interpretation, but you can see their value. They have lower validity and reliability scores. They're not as consistent. I think that their scores are low, moderate in terms of, but they still have scores, and they're still valuable when used with the more clarifying tools under these conditions, and they can be an alternative to help gain insights that you can't get from the other tests, and also help offset the self-report bias, particularly in more severe cases. So why the PRISM? Well, by now you've probably already figured it out. In terms of trait and typology tests, which is personality type tests, remember, we've looked at the Big Five, the Myers-Briggs, the MMPI a little bit, and then projective tests. right? And these are just a few of them that reflect some of the primary traits. And even just thinking about these, we have a massive amount of information that we can use. And yet there's many more, quite a few more personality tests out there of different kinds. And what they reflect is that we've got a wide variety of personalities, and they all, even these things, can mix up in a wide variety of ways. So we're all quite different from one another. Your brain is the most complex organ in the known universe, wired like no other, and so is everyone else's. Well, that's quite something to contemplate. See you in slideshow number 2.